Hey, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Rising Tide Leadership Podcast. Today, I am pumped to have my buddy, Pastor David Bartosik, join us. David is a pastor with a deep passion for ministry, leadership, and the gospel's transformative power. So in this episode, we're going to explore powerful concepts from his sermons, writings, and other influential materials and people that have inspired David. So, Dave, what's up, brother? Welcome to the show.
Hey, what's up, Mo? Thanks for having me, man.
Dude, I am so excited to have you here. We've known each other for quite a few years now. And why don't you just tell my audience a little bit about yourself and your journey?
So how did we get to know each other, Mo? Am I allowed to say how we got to know each other?
You're absolutely allowed to. This is your show.
So I was a student pastor back in sunny Southern California, and we used to run this wonderful water ski camp with students and leaders. It was this in-house incredible experience, and we loved bringing an outside face, an outside speaker. And so I reached out to a mutual friend of ours, Lem Usita, and just said, "Hey, Lem, I'm looking for someone to come and share, and who do you have for me?" And all his best available people were unavailable. So he told me Mo would be a great. I'm just kidding. Mo was fantastic. Mo was incredible. Mo was incredible because it's a demanding environment where it wasn't just come and speak, but it was actually come and be involved in students' lives. And so we got to get to know each other through that. And this is where it was a beautiful thing. It wasn't just one and done. It was Mo stayed in my life and continued to encourage me these years later. And so I'm thankful for Mo's friendship beyond just the speaking gig. This is my daughter, Eden. Eden, you want to come say hi? Eden is much like my kids, says I'm too loud in most things, that I have a volume that I should probably tone it down a little bit. You want to say hi? Why don't you wave and say hi?
Say hi to my audience, Eden. There you go.
You want to wave and say hi? Nice job.
Wow, you are a cutie.
So, moved to Wisconsin 5 years ago, born and raised in Hawaii, went to college in Southern California at Biola, got a business degree, and then started working in a local church in Southern California. My wife and I got to spend a year in Eastern Europe in Kosovo, working with a church there, getting to serve a local pastor, a Kosovar, an Albanian man there, and then came back and continued vocational ministry and stepped into a lead pastor role here in the Madison, Wisconsin area about 5 years ago at Hillcrest Bible Church, and it's been delightful. I got 3 wonderfully adopted kids that are twin 10-year-olds, a 9-year-old, and then God in his infinite wisdom decided to bring Eden into our life, who you just saw 3 years ago. And so my wife and I are delighted to have those 4 kids. I'm married for 15 years and excited for all that God continues to have for the days ahead.
Man, that's awesome, brother. Before I start asking all my questions about all the material you sent me, because you did send me a ton, it was great going over it. As I asked my commander, sir, do you have any opening remarks?
I open-handed. You know, the prayer we often say is, God, what are you inviting me into today? And so wherever you want to take us, Mo, I am along for the ride.
I love it. So let's start with Thomas Chalmers' work, The Explosive Power of a New Affection. You sent me this read. It was great, and it's such a rich and profound piece of writing. How do you see Chalmers' ideas relating to leadership, particularly in fostering change and inspiring vision in others, and what has it done for you and your congregation?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. If you don't read old dead guys and believe that everything that new and flashy is it, then I think there's areas to grow. I think we can read old dead guys or women, old dead women, and read their writings and believe that God has been working throughout history in people just like you and me throughout different time periods. Thomas Chalmers in particular inspires me. It's such a foundational idea that feels so transferable. We're all looking to fill this God-shaped hole. We're all looking for something. And as soon as you identify something in your life, good, bad, or indifferent, the way to remove it from your life isn't to just become so inward focused and just, oh man, I just need to dial this in, but rather is to find something greater that holds and yields greater affection than whatever it might be. And we see that as little kids growing up. You might be inundated with the toys. I'm looking around in my living room floor at all the Peppa Pig and Bluey toys scattered all over the floor. But we know at some point those toys no longer hold the same appeal, and suddenly the Christmas list starts getting filled with Birkenstocks and like iPads. And it's like, man, can we go back to the days of Bluey and what those things cost? And so we just understand there's something greater. And so when we think of even our leadership context, sometimes there's things that we're inundated with and we spend all our time and energy and resources on, and yet would we believe there's something greater that we could invest our time and energy in and be captivated by that? And naturally, these things that we feel are so overwhelming become and hold less sway in our life.
Chalmers emphasizes the need for greater affection to drive out lesser ones. How does this principle apply to helping leaders and teams move beyond destructive habits or distractions?
Yeah, and just as I alluded to the Bluey and Peppa Pig, it feels like sometimes if you think in terms of criticism, you could think of beating people up with lesser things. You didn't do this. You didn't do this. You didn't do this. You didn't meet this deadline. You didn't build this team, and you didn't accomplish this goal. And so, as true as those things might be, the better way to root those systemic issues or those challenges out, I would argue, isn't by identifying those criticisms so much as identifying the opportunity of what we have. So rather than say you didn't meet this deadline, we might say, what would it look like to meet this deadline in the future? Rather than criticize, you're not building your teams, what would it look like to say, give me a sense of what a successful team could look like? And so replacing these lesser affections with a greater opportunity and seeing that, being captivated by that, naturally then leads these other things to be pushed out or grown or solved.
Yeah, I love that you can, the way that I see it is come from one side of the table and to the other side of the table. So you're sitting with somebody going through their experiences. So how have you seen this concept in your ministry or leadership experience? And could you share an example with us where new affection reoriented someone's priorities or approach?
Again, and so I'm a pastor, and so for me, the issue for me comes around how you see spiritual growth take place. And sometimes it feels like in the church we measure lag indicators. We measure baptisms or we measure membership or conversion, and I go, those are positive, but how might we experience that? It's when we see Jesus as satisfying. And so rather than compelling someone and forcing someone to share their faith, to evangelize and give you the 10 steps on how to do it, what would it look like to be captivated more wholly in our own hearts with who Jesus is and see those other indicators flow out of that? And so for us, that for me, and if you're familiar with the church, sometimes it feels like we join these accountability groups as a way to grow. And we focus more on the specific behaviors rather than be captivated with higher affections, namely Jesus, when the inevitable lag indicators would be sharing my faith, praying more. And so for us, that becomes a fundamental way we operate on our teams. The business of the church is grace and forgiveness and hearing from God through his word. And so why would we focus on those lag metrics rather than focusing our time and energy as a leadership team, as a staff, as an elder board, and actually practicing the very thing we want more of for others, which is more of Jesus? And so reading the Bible collectively as a staff, reading the Bible collectively as an elder board, then produces those other lag indicators, which is sharing your faith, which is greater prayer life, which is having a heart to see more lives baptized.
Yeah, let me ask you this. What's your go-to version for the Bible? Everybody always asks me as a pastor, Mo, what do you use? And I use a ton of them, but what do you use when you're up at the pulpit?
So I've heard the extra spiritual version is the one that is more universal. The ESV is the one we use.
Yeah,
And not to diminish the NIV, the NASB. Again, you're always trying to balance between a wooden translation and a more phrase for phrase, right? Word for word versus thought for thought. And so I tend to go more word for word, but I also deeply appreciate Eugene Peterson. He's been a great influence in my life, along
absolutely.
with a few other faces. So I'm not opposed to reading the Message, just being reinvigorated with more of a thought for thought or a paraphrase.
Yeah, that's great. When I was growing up, when I first was under the leadership of Kevin, it was the NIV, also known as the nearly inspired version. So yeah, so the NIV has kind of been my go-to, but I do use the ESV. And in college, we use the NASB and the NRSV. So there's a bunch out there, and everybody's like, how does God keep on coming up with these new versions? See, he's working overtime. I don't know. So there you go. I want to touch on the Desiring God video by John Piper that you sent to me. His teaching often emphasizes the importance of delighting in God as central to our lives. How does this idea of desiring God shape how you lead and minister to others?
Yeah. So like we said, Eugene Peterson was an influence. Thankful for John Piper and some of the stuff that he's published and helping point people to the biblical ideas that are there. And one of those ideas that we see all over the biblical text is joy, is happiness. And it feels like in the local church, in our context, sometimes it feels like our greatest tool to wield against people is not one of joy, happiness, but it's one of guilt and obligation and shame. In order to motivate someone, we wield this tool of guilt and shame and obligation. And it feels like people recognize this. A famous theologian, I think his name was Billy Joel, he says, I'd rather laugh with the sinners than cry with the saints. The sinners are a lot more fun, and only the good die young. And so we understand, and our modern day theologians like Billy Joel understand, sometimes Christians operate more with this remote, kind of depressing attitude, but they claim to have the greatest gift on earth, namely Jesus. And so what it seems like in our world, Christians say you got to turn from your joy and turn toward God. You got to remove happiness from your life because the world knows happiness. So you got to run from happiness and go towards God. And it seems like that John Piper video, which I appreciate, which is true, which is what Paul claims to believe. Rejoice always. Again, I say rejoice. And Thomas Chalmers walks us through. It's an increasing movement towards God. It's an increasing movement of every decision motivated by your desire to be happy. We get that a donut makes us happy. We get it. It makes us happy. But it's only happiness for a short period of time. And then we move from a donut to a car. Man, that brand new car is wonderful. That brand new car smell. I don't know, maybe you put mint leaves in there. I don't know what you do, but that car grows rust and grows old. Maybe you got in an accident. That house that you dream of with a lakefront property or a drainage pond in your backyard. That's what you dream of. But even the house starts to get old and deteriorate, and your kids color around the walls. But what if we found our delight in an eternal, unchanging being that doesn't grow old, that doesn't tire, that never ends, and our happiness is found in Him? Therefore, then, when our happiness is diminished, it's not that He has changed, but it's actually that we have moved. And so we then return to going back to the fountain, the never-ending eternal fountain of life with Jesus.
That's exactly what Piper talks about, joy and satisfaction in God being foundational. So how can leaders cultivate a culture where their teams find joy and purpose in their works, especially in ministry?
And maybe if it's okay, if you'll allow me, what do you think are the main reasons that prevent people from accomplishing that? What feel like some of the barriers that we run into in the organizations we lead that prevent that from happening?
So
Mo wasn't ready. Were you ready for that question, Mo? I'm sorry. Otherwise, I can keep talking.
I've got my thoughts. Just briefly, I echo what you have to say, that it's easy to move away from the things that are important. And so purpose has to be focused in the right area. What does God want for me? And so when I am doing ministry, when I'm creating a culture, I want people to understand everything goes back in the box, meaning life is a game. And when you have 6 people carrying you out and you're laid to rest, everything goes back in the box. You don't take anything with you except for your relationship with God and the relationships that you have created. So I create culture around relationships. So what is it for you in your ministry? Because again, being able to be a part of your student ministry years ago and then seeing the growth in you to becoming a senior pastor, what are the things that you focus on that help people find that joy, find that purpose in their work, in the ministry that they do with you at church?
No, I love how you kept and relentlessly used the word purpose. And so fundamentally, if you believe, and this is where I go, it feels like a massive starting point that isn't affirmed by all. But if you believe every decision is motivated by your desire to be happy, you extend that to those around you. And if you believe everyone is looking to be happy, we see Blaise Pascal in his Pisces describe that this is true for all people. And we lovers praise their mistresses, poets praise the countryside. We're looking to declare what we believe, where happiness is found. And so as you assess your team, you could assume that that's true for them. They might be finding happiness in the paycheck. They might not be as engaged because they're simply finding their delight in receiving a paycheck. And so most of the conversations then revolve around their pay increase and whether that is based upon the merit they accomplished. They could be looking for vacation and time off. Maybe that's where delight is found. And so For them, the benefits package that you provide is where happiness is found in order for them to have a life of travel. Maybe for them, there's a myriad of other ways. Maybe it's their family's perception of the job that they have attained, despite the fact that they might not be delighting in the job itself. They're delighting in the perception and the prestige of what the job provides. What you said multiple times would be something for me is where I want to draw people. Do you actually believe in the mission? Do you actually believe in what we are about as an organization? Do you find your delight in fulfilling that mission? And when I think about the church, there's only two things that God mandated. He mandated the family, He ordained the family, and He ordained the church. Those are the only two organizations or systems that God ordained, and God loves those systems. And so when you think of the church, sometimes we find our happiness in how many budgets or buildings we have. And we would say those would be the wrong metrics to find delight in. Sometimes we find it in people's approval or praise of a sermon or a song or a program we ran versus joining Jesus in His mission. So for me, reminding our people and reminding our team what the mission is. And I love how Eugene Peterson talks about it. He talks about it as a long obedience in the same direction. I can continue to lift my eyes to join in that purpose and that mission. And the beauty is, here's what I've heard said. I'm paid to be good, and our people are good for nothing, right? I mean, I'm paid. I get paid to do this stuff, right? I tell our people all the time. I don't know if you guys know this. You guys pay me to do what you guys do for free. And it's an incredible thing that I get to join in people's lives and be a part of what God's up to in their stories, because we're joining Jesus in His mission.
Yeah, it really is humbling, and it's great to be able to be in ministry. So for people that experience loss of joy, what are the practical steps that you would recommend to realign affections and rediscover their passion for their calling?
And it feels like you're stumbling upon the greatest conundrum, right? Life is hard. Sufferings are real, but do we believe Jesus is better? A buddy Drew of mine often says there's no bad news in the kingdom. And I'm thankful for a guy named Todd Chapman and a guy named Dan Jones who described what suffering is. Suffering is this gap between my desired state and my actual state. I have a desire of where I'd like to be, and then I actually find myself planted in a certain place. And so we could think about that for any number of things. I'd prefer not to have cancer, but I have cancer. I'd prefer not to be without a job, but I find myself without a job. The question then becomes back to that original question of the desire to be happy. Has Jesus left us in our state? He's with us. And so can I believe that the happiness I have isn't predicated on my health condition, isn't predicated on my financial state, isn't predicated on my vocational state? My happiness is rooted in an eternal, unchanging being. And so if my happiness is there, when I'm encountering suffering, we hear James say, take joy, my brothers, when you experience trials of various kinds, for this is good for your faith, because Jesus is present with us in our suffering. And so I never want to preach that theology to someone who is in the midst of the job loss, who is hurting in the midst of stage 3 or stage 4 cancer. Instead, we grieve with those who grieve. And yet, prior to or coming out of some type of suffering, it is then when we get to enlighten or illuminate that God was up to something in the midst of those trials. And so usually in the midst of, you grieve with those who grieve. But we are confident that there is happiness to be found in the midst of trials. Joy in Jesus is possible, despite the circumstances.
That's a great segue to talk about your sermon, and we'll put your sermon link in the show notes on James 1:1-4, and it's titled Commanded to be Happy. What a cool topic. Could you summarize the main message of that sermon for my listeners?
And that's probably a younger David from a couple years ago and a few pounds ago would be my guess. And so hopefully there's no judgment if you happen to go watch that.
It was great. I loved it. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's a conviction straight from James, where happiness in Jesus forever in the midst of the challenging circumstances.
Yeah. So you talk about in that sermon finding joy in trials. None of us want to hear that. I don't want to hear that. Just like you said, when somebody's going through something, the last thing they want to hear is, let me tell you why you should be happy about all this bad stuff that's happening in your life. So as leaders, we're in the business of dealing with problems. If there weren't problems, they wouldn't need a pastor. They wouldn't need to come to
No.
church and get the good stuff. They just say, oh, I can just read my Bible and I'm good to go. But we need that. And so God calls leaders, God calls people to the ministry. You have calling, David. So as a leader and as leaders, how can we lead our teams to embrace these trials as opportunities for growth without making them want to leave our church?
Yeah, it feels like two of the obstacles that are just even implied in what you're saying is one, you're telling me, David, that I need to be happy with or in that particular circumstance. And that feels like a misinterpretation of what we're saying. I think the equivalent back to Thomas Chalmers, I love my 15 years, but I do not love doing the dishes, right? It makes my hands pruny. You get all the crumbs on you, and sometimes it dunks up the dishwasher. Like,
Yep.
I don't love washing the dishes. But the happiness found in loving my wife supersedes doing the dishes. And so in the midst of doing dishes, I can be happy, not in the dishes themselves, but in the delight and joy that I find and the happiness that I found in loving my wife and my relationship with my wife. In the same way, I think that's one of the misnomers about what we're saying when we say find joy in the midst of circumstances. It's not in the cancer itself, but it's in God in the midst of the trial of the cancer. Second, I think, again, it's the misnomer of what happiness is in terms of a glad countenance like a clown. That's not what we're saying. If you've ever been in a delivery room, you can imagine that a mom or a dad have tears streaming down their face. And what do the tears represent? The tears aren't sadness. They're not tears of sadness. They're actually tears of deep happiness in this baby that they're holding. And so sometimes the misconception is happiness is this clown-like happiness, but rather it's a profound, deep sense of true joy, true happiness. And so what does that look like? We as leaders are trying to help constantly lift people's eyes to whatever that would be that's greater, that supersedes their circumstances. Those TPS reports, or where's my stapler? Where's my stapler, right? I mean, I could get so drowned in thinking about where my stapler is, and it could overwhelm me and blind me. And we are constantly trying to lift people's eyes back to the purpose, back to the mission, back to what we are all accomplishing together, is so we're not drowning in the midst of seeing our fingers get pruny and wondering where our stapler is. And so that would be one of the ways we are constantly drawing people's eyes as leaders in our organizations.
That's why we're friends, Dave, because office spaces, those references. So if you don't have a
Did
red
you want to go
stapler,
outside and like throw a printer on the floor? Were you just inspired and you heard some lyrics starting to play in your mind about
absolutely.
feeling
With
good
that,
about being a gangster?
grab that baseball bat. Yeah, man. Dude, so in your sermon, you highlight how the scattered church learned to live out their faith in their specific spheres of influence. And so they would demonstrate their faith through action. So how do you sustain a community leading that church, especially when they've got all these things going on that are pulling them from what they need to be doing? What do you do?
Yeah. So I think, like we said earlier, God is a God of order. He is a God of order, right? He set the solar system up in a certain way. The earth and the sun rotate in a certain way. And so we have fundamental rhythms to our life. We gather every week on a Sunday, and we are reminded of this reality. Sunday becomes the huddle. It becomes a place where we gather to be reminded that God is who he said he is, and we are his children. We are his kids. And so we can find our delight, our joy in him. And then we are sent back out to the world. Again, I love my buddy Drew and his phrase, we are sent back out to be the living proof of a loving God. And so we get commissioned to actually share the joy that we have. We see our tank filled with more of who God is, and then we are empowered to go back out to a world that is looking for that happiness. They're looking and they're searching all over the place. Some are looking for donuts. Some are looking for cars, for homes, for careers, and they're looking and searching, believing that those things provide happiness beyond what they were intended to. Because a donut does provide happiness, a car does, but does it provide the ultimate satisfaction that is found in Jesus? And so we get to be sent out. But then sometimes that could feel lonely. That could feel like we are the only one. I look around in my workplace and am I the only one? And so then the other rhythm is coming back to a community. We call them life groups, and coming back and anchoring ourselves in a group of 8 to 16 people that huddle around us and remind us you aren't alone in this journey. And so we continue to believe the harvest is plentiful, the laborers are few, and it's full of people looking for this delight and happiness in life. And we get to be conduits of God's grace in people's lives.
Yeah, I think the difference between joy and happiness is any other donut shop except for Donut Man in Glendora, California. And true joy is the buttermilk bar that you get from Donut Man. Other than that, I can't tell you much more, man. So what's your go-to donut?
Man, I'm a kid at heart. I'm a kid at heart. I just want, give me
Sprinkles.
the frosting. Give me the frosting and sprinkles every day. Just give me the frosting and sprinkles. Like if I'm feeling a little bougie, then maybe we'll get like, I don't know, a cruller or something like that. And I'm like, hey, look, this is a light donut, but no, just give me the frosting and sprinkles. Just and load it up. And if you happen to make it like in one of those like cake size boxes, that would be even better.
The pink box, gotta love it. Hey, it's your fault. You keep on bringing up donuts, man. And now I'm thinking about my favorite donuts. So you shared a story in your sermon speaking about people going through things in life, about Tim and Patty's life group, which surrounded Patty with love and cared during one of her most difficult moments. So what leadership lessons can we draw from their example of stepping into someone's suffering to foster joy and healing?
Mm. Again, and then this is just where these aren't ivory tower intellectual ideas, right? These aren't stuffy ideas. They come to bear in everyday real circumstances. I think we all face challenges in different ways, shapes, and forms throughout our life and to varying degrees. And the question continues to remain, is Jesus sweeter? And one of the ways that gets manifest is in relationship. We get to see real people come alongside us and demonstrate care and support, not allowing us to exclusively wallow in our pain, but also not diminishing the pain and grief we're feeling. And so, man, that's a delicate balance. And sometimes if you've been in the church long enough, that you either feel like you felt the hammer from people saying stop feeling that, or you felt like you were almost allowed to feel an extreme amount of emotions that were sometimes unwarranted. And so you were almost celebrated for some of the extreme places you were going rather than an invitation to grow. Or you were hit and you were literally or figuratively Bible thumped and you were told to stop those emotions or those emotions aren't godly. And so it becomes a delicate balance of walking with people, but that's where it's not some ivory tower, some stuffy, closed door theological conversation, but comes to bear in our lives week in and week out in real ways. And so it takes from our vantage point two things. It takes someone who actually has the theological construct to believe there is happiness to be found in Christ, someone who actually believes there is delighting in him, but it also takes someone who can model what joy in the midst of suffering looks like. We don't have models, but we don't actually have someone that we've seen walk through difficult circumstances with delight and happiness in Christ. But we don't actually know who those people look like. And so I'm so thankful that one, for the theological construct that Thomas Chalmers, John Piper, and others, Todd Chapman, Drew Soderstrom have provided, but also to have people in our life that walked through challenging circumstances and showed Jesus is better. There was a guy named Wally Norling. I got to sit with him for the last 2 years of his life, and some called him Wally Snorling. Wasn't necessarily the best preacher, and yet the men that valued his investment was astounding. Chuck Swindoll would call Wally a mentor. Larry Osborne would call Wally a mentor. I would call Wally a mentor. I got to sit with Wally Norling for the last 2 years of his life before he died. Oxygen mask in his nose, hobbling through. His sweet wife would bring us date bars and orange juice, and we just crack open Ephesians. And I watched Wally slowly die. I was going to meet him on a Tuesday morning, and his wife Betty called me and said, "Hey, David, you're not going to be able to come today. Wally passed away." But what we watched Wally do in the midst of deep suffering, deep medical and the fragileness of life, deep suffering, he would say, "I wish I could sing the Hallelujah chorus because of how ecstatic I am to meet my Savior, how delighted I am in the midst of suffering." We just don't have those models. We don't know anybody who is happy in Jesus. We know these people. It sucks. I hate my life. This is the worst. We know those people. We don't actually know anybody who has the theological construct as well as is practically living it out in our lives before us. And so that's what we see in those people that you're referencing. They were walking it with people who they had seen live this stuff out.
Wow, that's great, brother. So for those of my audience who go to work every day, they're at the office or they're in the field or whatever they're doing, James talks about how trials serve as tests that reveal strength of faith. So how do you encourage leaders to count it all joy when facing professional or personal challenges?
Yeah. Yeah, and it could feel cliche, and I don't believe it is. I believe people are watching, and it could feel cliche if they're simply watching, but you've never actually verbalized anything. I would say maybe there's some steps into people's lives you could take relationally. But if you've done that, people are watching. You become a model to others who, again, and hear me say, my lens, I'm coming as a pastor who's primarily speaking to those that treasure Jesus, but even if you don't, there would be the invitation. But for that lens, as you're living your life, people are watching, and they're watching for how you respond. And so when you think as an organization, when one of your employees leaves to go take a grass is greener job, the rest of your employees are watching as they're perceiving your response. How is our leader going to respond to this challenging circumstance? Immediately go to blame? Are they going to immediately go to guilting others that they weren't performing as well? Are they going to throw the other person under the bus and diminish the quality or caliber that other person had brought? Or do they continue and relentlessly pursue the mission that's before them, believing that's where their delight, their happiness is found, and they're calling other people into that? And so when challenging things happen, do we believe that there is a buoy for our life, for our soul? And as people are watching, we get to be those models that are so rare.
How has your faith shaped your leadership style, and how do you integrate biblical principles into your leadership approach?
I'd like to believe as a pastor, they are seamlessly integrated in all areas of life, but you and I maybe know that's not the case for all pastors. There's a quote again from Eugene Peterson where he calls pastors shopkeepers. And it's one of the most sobering quotes. Maybe Mo can pull up the quote and put it in the show notes. But it's one of the most sobering quotes for a pastor, for a faith leader, is sometimes people get consumed with the shopkeeper mentality. He says American pastors are abandoning their posts constantly. They're not leaving churches. The churches still pay their salaries, but they're abandoning their posts. They're becoming shopkeepers. And the shops they keep are churches. Their constant concerns are how to keep customers happy, how to lure customers away from down the street, and how to develop splendid reputations and gain large sums of money. And some of them, in reality, are very good shopkeepers. But shopkeepers just the same. Instead, he says, there are no successful churches. What there are communities of sinners that gather week in and week out. The Holy Spirit gathers them and does his work in them. And one or some of these sinners are called pastor. And their responsibility is to keep a community attentive to God. And it's that responsibility that is being abandoned in spades. We begin, even as faith leaders, finding our happiness in these other things rather than keeping people attentive to God, believing that is the mission, that becomes the metric. And so your question, how does that apply in our context? And I could get consumed in so many other things. We could be spending our time, our energy, our resources, so many other things. How do we devote our time to the teaching and preaching of the word and the prayer of the saints? And that feels like what anchors our life in our rhythms week in and week out.
I think I found the quote by Peterson that says, the pastors of America have metamorphosized into a company of shopkeepers, and the shops they keep are churches. They are preoccupied with shopkeepers' concerns: how to keep the customers happy, how to lure customers away from their competitors down the street, how to package the goods so that the customers will lay out the money. Some of them are very good shopkeepers. They attract a lot of customers, pull in great sums of money, develop splendid reputations, yet it is still shopkeeping, religious shopkeeping, to be sure, but it is shopkeeping all the same. That's pretty crazy.
And so as it pertains to trials and joy, that feels like where it comes to bear. If the success is predicated on those other elements, then we may diminish and push aside these trials in life rather than sit long enough, because some of those are year-long challenges, years of challenges. And instead of just walking over people or diminishing the grief, do we have models, and are we models that demonstrate life is hard, suffering is real, but Jesus is better?
When you are casting vision, how do you encourage a culture of growth, both spiritually and professionally, for the people in your church and your organization as a whole?
Yeah, and I love it. And so your audience may have mixed feelings about the name, but I love the quote. Sometimes it feels like we've inherited a culture of bigger is better. And if it's big and shiny and glamorous, therefore it's successful. And I don't buy that premise. I love what Andy Stanley says. He says, do for one what you wish you could do for many. How might we begin seeing the person in front of us as the most important person, and we do for one what we wish you could do for many? We look around and we see the hurt and brokenness of our society. We see the political chasm that exists. We see the poverty or homelessness or whatever issue that you believe exists in this world. And somehow we point the finger as, what if this could be better? What if that was solved and nothing ever gets done? What would it look like if we truly believe, do for one what we wished we could do for many, and then take that first step? Who's your one? Who's the one person in your life that you believe God has put in front of you that you see in need? And what's the need? Again, this whole conversation has been predicated on delight yourself in the law of the Lord. Find your happiness in Jesus above anything else this life has to offer. Who is the person right in front of you who might be suffering, who might be hurting, who might be grieving, or who has a gap between their actual state and their desired state? They think something is going to make them happier than it actually will. Instead, you get to step in and do for one what you wish you could do for many.
I feel like I'm listening to the sermon right now. So before we wrap up, what final encouragement would you give to leaders, whether in ministry or the workplace, about leading with joy and intentionality?
Two words that I always appreciated that my former lead pastor would say, these two great words of encouragement: don't suck, right? I mean, like if you're looking to be motivated and inspired and regaled with the glories of all that's in front of you, two simple words.
Yes. Dude,
no,
that's great. No, well, what I was going to say is that was actually a mantra at my old church. And we would always baptize somebody when they were speaking for the first time, right before they got up to speak, whether it was a youth group or big church. And you'd say, hey, before you go on, I want to give you a quick encouragement. They just look at you like, waiting because you've been in ministry longer, and like, here it is. Here's the great wisdom. Here's what it's going to take to be good at speaking. You say, dude, don't suck. And then you just see the blood just drain from their face. Hey, but it really gets you thinking. So, dude, we are of the same mind. We are brothers. So anyway, keep going.
I think the totality. What's just the next step, right? Sometimes we see some A to Z experience, and so what would it look like just to go A to B? And what might be that next step for us to actually truncate the process, to not get ahead of ourselves. Sometimes feels in the uncertainty and the worry and the unknown, we begin to craft all types of scenarios. And so what would it look like to take our faithful step today to believe that there is more joy in Jesus than anything else that life has to offer? What would be my faithful step to explore that? Maybe the first step would be, I've always seen joy and happiness as different. What would it look like to explore entering into seeing those as synonymous? Maybe right now there's someone in your life that is looking for happiness and you actually have the answer. You believe that Jesus is who he said he is. What would it look like to begin a conversation or a relationship with that person towards moving them to the cross? Not dropping the 4 spiritual laws and dropping the gospel, but just simply taking an interest in their life, maybe bringing them cookies or a cup of coffee this holiday season. What would your first step be in moving towards more life with Jesus and happiness in him?
That's powerful. Where can our listeners find your sermons or connect with you to learn more about your work?
Yeah, we're out in Madison, Wisconsin at hillcrestbiblechurch.com, and buddy Jeremy and I have just launched pastor-theologian.com, Pastor Theologian Collective in the Madison area, and it's an opportunity for like-minded people to gather to hear a robust, dynamic conversation around some theological idea and then chop it up with other like-minded ministry leaders. And so if you're anywhere in the Madison area, that's a relational platform to get connected to, or would love to see you jump in to a live stream on hillcrestbiblechurch.com.
That's great. We'll put those links in the show notes for the listeners as well. And last question, Dave, who's someone in leadership that you know needs to be on the Rising Tide Leadership podcast to share about their journey of leadership with my listeners?
You've heard me mention a variety of times. I am deeply encouraged by Northern California, a church called Vintage Grace, doing some great things. And Drew Soderstrom, Dave Kroll, these are great people to continue to offer perspective in something they're launching called Disciples Made Here. DisciplesMadeHere.org would be a great next step.
You'll have to make those connections so we can keep bringing good leadership stuff for my audience. So Pastor David Bartosik, thanks for joining us today. Man, your insights, you're always inspiring. I know that my listeners are going to walk away feeling encouraged to lead well. Thanks for tuning in to our podcast today. If you enjoyed this, don't forget to subscribe, share, leave a review. And until next time, keep rising. Thanks a lot, Pastor Dave.
Thanks, Mo.